Imagine this, a quiet English village, 1965. Cobblestone lanes, smoke curling from chimneys, children playing in fields that hadn't changed in centuries. And then, without warning, an entire family vanishes. No struggle, no blood, no goodbye. Just absence. But absence leaves a trace if you know where to look. 3 months later, investigators found a room no villager admitted existed beneath St. Mary's Church. Inside, the belongings of the Higgins family, and journals that should have been impossible. Journals written 2 weeks after their disappearance. Do you understand what that means? The family was still alive, still writing, while the village believed them gone, and what those pages revealed was darker than any disappearance. Darker than death itself. They spoke of rituals, of ancient obligations buried by the church centuries ago, knowledge that no one was meant to survive knowing. For nearly 60 years the church has denied it, records sealed, witnesses silenced. But tonight, we break that silence. We open the door they tried to lock. Once you hear what I'm about to tell you, you cannot unhear it. This is not just a mystery. This is a map into the machinery of hidden power. Ashworth was not an ordinary village. On the surface, it was picture-book England. Rolling hills, centuries-old cottages, the sound of church bells drifting across stone walls weathered by time. But beneath the charm was something older, something that refused to die. The village was built around St. Mary's, a Norman church erected in 1187, on top of a Saxon chapel, which itself stood on even older ground, a site the locals once called the Hollow of Offerings. Generations had whispered that the land itself was consecrated not to God, but to something else. And in 1965 the signs began to surface again, fog that came too early, clinging to the church walls like breath on glass, bells that rang when no one touched the ropes, their tones warped and heavy as though pulled from underground. Even children reported paths in the graveyard shifting beneath their feet, leading them in circles that never ended. The villagers dismissed it as autumn unease, the tricks of cold and mist. But the Higgins family, they didn't dismiss it. They were drawn into it, and soon they became the offering, not by accident, by design. Thomas Higgins was a man of habit, 38 years old, precise in every movement, the kind of man whose life ticked like a clock wound by tradition. Each morning he walked his children to school, then to the post office where he kept order with steady hands. His faith was simple, firm, unshaken. But that steadiness was exactly what made what happened so incomprehensible. His wife, Eleanor Mary, restless, intelligent, touched with a curiosity that didn't belong in a village chained to silence. She kept herbs the older women remembered from their grandmothers, herbs no one spoke of in polite company. When pressed, she would smile and say she was tending the old ways. Their children mirrored the strange duality. Margaret, 12, sharp-eyed, burdened with a wisdom far beyond her years, and young Billy, just 8, charming, radiant, but obsessed with drawing symbols and figures no teacher could explain. The Higgins family appeared ordinary, but to those watching closely, they were being shaped, prepared. Because in Ashworth, families were never just families. They were bloodlines, chosen pieces in a ritual that stretched back centuries. And the Higgins family had inherited a role they could neither refuse nor escape. It began quietly, almost innocently. The Higgins children stopped sleeping. At night, Margaret claimed she heard knocking beneath the floorboards, not the creaks of an old house, but deliberate patterns. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 again, like a code. Billy began waking, drenched in sweat, clutching drawings of twisted figures with hollow eyes, insisting they stood by his bed. Eleanor kept journals in which she recorded her dreams where she walked the church at night only to find its doors open, the pews filled with shadows that turned their heads in perfect unison. Thomas dismissed it all as nerves, a family rattled by autumn storms and village gossip. But then the neighbors noticed strange things too. Lights in the Higgins' upper windows long after midnight, Voices drifting across the fields, low and rhythmic, nothing like conversation. On one night in October, a farmer swore he saw Eleanor leading the children toward St. Mary's at 3 a.m, their eyes open but vacant, like sleepwalkers. By dawn, they were back in their beds as though nothing had happened. The village pretended not to notice, but everyone knew the old stories. When the Hollow called, it always began this way. The first journal appeared in the village a week after the Higgins family vanished. A local boy claimed he found it wedged in the roots of an ash tree near the churchyard, bound in cracked leather that smelled of smoke. Inside were Eleanor's words, written in her careful hand, dated 2 weeks after the disappearance. She described walking the nave of St. Mary's at night, the air heavy with incense, though no service had been held, her children whispering prayers in a language she didn't recognize. The most chilling entries were not about what she saw, but what she felt, that the walls of the church were alive, pulsing like flesh, listening. More journals surfaced over the years, always hidden in places no one could explain, beneath floorboards, inside hollow gravestones, even stitched into the lining of a pew, and every single one was dated after 1965. Scholars dismissed them as forgeries, village folklore designed to attract attention. But the handwriting was verified. The ink, the paper, all matched the Higgins era. The conclusion no one dared to speak was simple. The family had not vanished at all. They had been taken elsewhere, kept alive, writing from inside something that was not supposed to exist. When the Higgins case grew impossible to ignore, outside investigators were called in. 2 men from London arrived in late November 1965, Inspector Halewood and Sergeant Dyer. They were met with silence, the kind of silence that feels rehearsed. No villager offered help. No one answered questions directly. Every road led back to St. Mary's. The investigators searched the church by day and found nothing, just crumbling stone, a cold altar, and the smell of damp earth. But on their third night, when the fog lay thick, Halewood noticed the floor near the altar rang hollow when struck with his cane. Beneath the loose slabs, they uncovered a staircase, narrow, spiraling into darkness, unmarked on any parish records. What they found below was not a crypt. It was a chamber carved from the bedrock itself, older than the church above. Symbols scarred the walls, burnt black into the stone, spirals and circles identical to those in young Billy's drawings. At the chamber's center was a stone table gouged with scratches that looked like fingernail marks. And though the place had clearly been abandoned for centuries, the investigators reported one detail they never included in the official file. The table was still warm. The chamber beneath St. Mary's was not new. It was not even medieval. Geological surveys dated the carvings in its walls to at least 1,000 years before the church was built, back to the early Saxon period, perhaps older still. And once the investigators began digging through parish archives, a darker pattern emerged. The Higgins family were not the first to vanish. In 1822, the Blakemore family, 6 souls, disappeared overnight from their farmhouse, leaving bread cooling on the hearth. In 1741, a census listed the Morley family as present, yet by year's end, no trace of them remained, their land seized quietly by the parish. Even older accounts spoke of the hollowing, nights when whole households were taken into the earth. Always families, always bloodlines with no surviving heirs. And in every case, one detail echoed across the centuries. Children had been seen drawing symbols on doors, in the dirt, or in books, shapes eerily similar to those carved beneath the altar. The Higgins case was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a ritual recurrence, a rhythm that pulsed through Ashworth across generations, feeding something that demanded silence and devotion. To speak of it was to invite it closer. When scholars finally began to examine the recovered Higgins journals in detail, they found something that defied all sense. The entries were not just accounts of what Eleanor and the children had seen. They described events that had not yet occurred. In a journal dated November 23, 1965, Eleanor wrote of 2 men in dark coats, lifting the altar stone and descending with lanterns. That was the very night Inspector Halewood and Sergeant Dyer uncovered the hidden chamber. Another entry, marked December 2nd, spoke of a child in the village who will not wake though her body breathes. Records confirm that on December 2nd, little Sarah Whitcomb fell into a coma doctors could never explain. The journals became a kind of cursed calendar, predicting misfortune with uncanny precision, harvest failures, livestock deaths, even the sudden collapse of Ashworth's bell tower in 1971. What unsettled investigators most was not the accuracy of these writings, but the implication. Eleanor had written them after the family's disappearance, sometimes years later, as if she and her children were still watching, still recording, from somewhere beyond reach. It suggested that the Higgins family had not simply vanished into the ground, they had slipped into a vantage point outside time itself. At first, Inspector Halewood dismissed the journals as an elaborate fraud, perhaps planted by the villagers themselves, but the more he read, the more the words began to gnaw at him. The handwriting was always the same, Eleanor's precise, looping script. And then he found an entry dated with his own name. Halewood descends again, though warned by the walls, and he leaves with something that follows him. The inspector never shared that line with Sergeant Dyer. Yet colleagues later recalled his sudden changes, his habit of muttering prayers under his breath, his refusal to enter churches, his violent temper when questioned about Ashworth. By spring of 1966, Halewood had resigned from the force, retreating to a small flat in Brixton, where he filled notebooks with spirals and circles, until his death in 1973. The coroner's report noted an unusual detail. The flesh beneath his fingernails was shredded, as though he had been clawing at stone. What made this worse was a discovery years later. When archivists cross-referenced his decline with the journals, they found Eleanor had written about Halewood's death, down to the month, nearly 8 years before it happened. The Higgins family had seen him die before he even began to wither. Sergeant Dyer, unlike Halewood, did not let fear consume him. He stayed with the case, piecing together fragments of testimony from villagers who spoke only when drink loosened their tongues. Slowly, a picture emerged of an unspoken pact. For generations, Ashworth had lived under a rule never written but deeply obeyed. When the signs appeared, children sketching spirals, doors marked with circles, whispers heard in the fields, one family would be taken, never more than one, never less. Their disappearance ensured the rest of the village would remain untouched for another cycle. Dyer was horrified, but the villagers insisted this was protection, not cruelty. The earth has to feed, one old farmer told him, better a few than all. Records hinted at quiet payments too. After each family vanished, their land and assets passed seamlessly to the parish, fueling Ashworth's odd prosperity even through famine and plague. Dyer realized the Higgins family had not been targeted by chance. They were simply the next in line. Every villager knew and every villager accepted, because silence was the price of survival. When Dyer threatened to expose them, the priest of St. Mary's delivered a chilling warning. If you break the pact, Sergeant, it will take more than families, it will take everyone. Sergeant Dyer could not accept the villagers' silence. Where Halewood had unraveled into paranoia, Dyer turned to obsession. He carried a tape recorder hidden in his coat, documenting whispered interviews with farmers, shopkeepers, even the schoolchildren who drew circles without knowing why. He sketched the chamber beneath St. Mary's in meticulous detail, convinced the carvings formed a sequence, an invocation repeated across centuries. But his greatest gamble came in the winter of 1967, when he learned the cycle was due to return. The journals spoke of a night without crow song, when earth still burns, but no one tends it. Dyer waited for that night, camera and lantern in hand, hiding near the edge of Ashworth. And then, just as the villagers had described, he saw the signs. A cottage on the outskirts, the Webb family home, stood with its chimney smoking, though no one stirred inside. Dyer entered, heart pounding, and found the house abandoned, supper plates warm on the table. From beneath the floorboards came a hollow thud, like something moving through stone. He swore later the earth itself shifted under his feet, breathing, pulling, until his lantern nearly went out. But when he fled to fetch help, The house was gone, vanished into open ground. For years, nothing more was heard of Sergeant Dyer. He left the force quietly in 1968, emigrated to Canada, and lived in obscurity until his death in 1982. But in 1994, his widow delivered a battered box of reels and notebooks to the British Library, claiming her husband had been haunted until the end. The recordings, though degraded, still carried his voice, steady at first, then trembling as nights wore on. On one tape he whispers, "They don't vanish. They're taken. You can hear the stones open if you're close enough." Then a sound fills the reel, a deep grinding, like rock splitting under immense weight, followed by something worse, a child's voice, clear as day, reciting the Lord's Prayer backward. The experts who analyzed the audio dismissed it as bleed-through or tampering, but those who listened in private swore it chilled their bones. Even more disturbing were his notes. Dyer had drawn the chamber's symbols over and over, aligning them with constellations, lunar phases, even bloodlines of Ashworth's families. His conclusion was stark. The ritual was not random. The families chosen were mapped generations in advance, selected to complete some hidden equation. The Higgins were simply the fulcrum, the family whose disappearance sealed the cycle for another century. In 2007, developers broke ground near the ruins of St. Mary's, intending to build a heritage centre. The church had long since collapsed, its foundations overgrown with nettle and ash. But beneath the rubble, archaeologists uncovered the chamber Dyer had described. At first it seemed a triumph, stonework untouched since the 17th century, carvings preserved in damp darkness. But then came the unease. The chamber was larger than anyone imagined, stretching into tunnels that coiled beneath the entire village. The walls bore not only spirals, but figures, elongated, faceless, their arms raised as if in eternal supplication. And then the bones were found. Not scattered, not jumbled, but arranged deliberately in arcs, as though forming a clock face. At the center lay a hollow stone sarcophagus, empty but lined with claw marks that no tool could explain. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Adrian Wells, called it a ritual site of unique anthropological value. Yet his report was suppressed within weeks. The land was quietly sealed, funding withdrawn, and the chamber refilled with concrete. Locals whispered that several workers refused to finish the job after hearing voices in the tunnels. One man claimed he saw children's hands pressing from the stone, leaving no prints behind. The official statement from the Ashworth excavation claimed no significant finds of cultural value, but fragments of Dr. Wells' private report surfaced years later through a disgruntled research assistant. What those pages revealed was far more chilling than archaeology. Wells had catalogued dozens of inscriptions too precise to dismiss as crude folk art. One spiral, when transcribed mathematically, aligned perfectly with the Fibonacci sequence, its ratios carved centuries before Europeans formally described it. Another bore Latin phrases interlaced with words no scholar recognized, syllables repeating in trio, as that linguists later compared to ritual chants recorded in Mesopotamian burial hymns. Most disturbing was Wells' note about the sarcophagus. Scratches appear to have originated from within. Material analysis suggests neither stone tool nor metal implement. Depth of etching implies pressure beyond human capability. He went further, suggesting the chamber's design was an engineered device rather than a tomb. A mechanism intended to channel energy, not house the dead. The report closed with a single handwritten line, underlined twice. This site does not belong to the past, it belongs to a system still active. Within months of the leak, Wells disappeared during a lecture tour in Prague. His body was never recovered. In 2019, strange reports began surfacing from the quiet lanes of Ashworth once more. Farmers spoke of livestock found dead in perfect circles, their bodies unmarked, eyes wide as though frozen in terror. Visitors claimed their phones glitched near the old churchyard, screens flashing geometric symbols no app could explain. And in the village school, a teacher found half the class doodling the same spiral pattern in their notebooks without instruction. Then came the night of February 11th. A hiker passing through Ashworth saw lights rising from the ground where St. Mary's once stood, columns of pale fire that flickered silently before sinking back into earth. His photos, blurry but undeniable, spread across online forums devoted to the paranormal. Days later, a family vanished. The Ketteridges, who lived only 2 streets from where the Higgins once stood, left their home with dinner still warm on the table. Police sealed the house, but locals whispered that inside, the wallpaper was etched with spirals burned deep into plaster. An independent researcher compared the images to Dyer's sketches from 1967. The patterns matched exactly. Once again, Ashworth had lost a family to the cycle, and once again the world looked away. The Higgins family was not the first to vanish in Ashworth. They were not the last. Their story is only a fragment of a pattern stretching across centuries and continents. From the caves of Cappadocia to the catacombs of Paris, from Kentucky's limestone tunnels to the chalk downs of southern England, symbols echo, spirals repeat, families disappear, always at intervals, always aligned with the same cycles of moon and star. The documents hidden, the reports suppressed, the witnesses discredited. It is not incompetence, but design. Dyer, Wells, the nameless monks of St. Mary's, they all pointed toward the same conclusion. What took the Higgins was not a tragedy of history, but an ongoing mechanism. A system that demands families at chosen times, as though feeding on lineage itself. And if the Ketteridges in 2019 prove anything, it is that the machine still turns. The ground does not forget, the stones do not sleep. Every disappearance is a reminder that we are not the masters of our past, but prisoners of something buried deep within it, something that selects, consumes, and resets the cycle, while we cling to the illusion of safety. The Higgins were not lost. They were claimed. And one day, so might we.